Tonight we open a door that was never meant to be touched. A door that leads to a version of history older than the Bible itself. The Vatican tells us humanity began with Adam, yet beneath the flood stories and the sacred verses lies a whisper of a world that came long before him. A world erased not by accident, but by design. Ancient stones carved with impossible precision. Scrolls locked in underground chambers. Maps showing continents that should not exist. Every trace points to a civilization wiped clean before Genesis was ever written, a forgotten age drowned in water and buried in silence. And the one institution that holds the missing pieces sits behind walls of marble and secrecy. For centuries the Vatican has guarded the story of the first beginning, but what if that beginning was only the second chapter in a far older tale? What if the flood was not just punishment, but a reset? What if humanity has risen and fallen long before the Garden of Eden was ever imagined? Those who searched for answers found sealed archives, forbidden manuscripts, and warnings carved into stone. Those who got too close were met with quiet doors and deeper shadows, and some simply vanished. So, before we descend into this mystery together, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because the story you are about to hear may change the way you see history itself. Imagine opening your eyes in a world where the beginning is not the beginning at all, where the story you were taught since childhood starts halfway through a much older tale. Picture a timeline that stretches far beyond Adam, far beyond Eden, into an age forgotten so completely that only scattered ruins and forbidden whispers remain. This is the place we step into now, a world erased not by accident, but by intention, a world that some say the Vatican has kept sealed behind ancient doors for centuries. What if the true first chapter of humanity was removed long before you were ever born, replaced with a cleaner version that fit neatly into scripture and law? Across deserts and mountains and oceans lie stones older than memory, cut with a precision that should not exist for a world supposedly young. Myths from distant cultures speak of a golden age, a time when people lived under strange skies and walked among mysteries that do not fit into the story of Adam. They speak of cities swallowed by the sea, of towers that reached the heavens, of beings who taught knowledge that humans should never have held. These stories are not placed in the official beginning because they do not belong to the world after Adam. They belong to something deeper, something earlier. If you stood before these ruins, you would feel it instantly, that eerie sense that the world before Genesis was not empty. It was full, alive, advanced in ways that feel almost impossible. But why does the Bible not speak of it? Why do the first pages of Genesis move so quickly, skipping from creation to catastrophe in a handful of lines? It is as if an entire era was lifted out, leaving only shadows on the edges. For centuries, researchers, monks, and explorers have whispered about missing records that describe a world washed away long before Noah's flood. A world so old that even the oldest stories tremble before it. And then there is the Vatican, the great keeper of sacred memory. Beneath its stone floors lie vaults stretching farther than the eye can imagine, holding manuscripts that no ordinary person will ever see. Some believe that among these locked shelves are texts hinting at civilizations that stood and fell before Adam ever took his first breath. If that is true, then the world we know is only the second act of a story much larger than we were told. Imagine a chronicle so ancient that it rewrites everything, one that speaks of a forgotten humanity rising to greatness long before the Garden of Eden was ever planted. Imagine it telling of a fall so devastating that time itself had to be reset, and all that remained was a single surviving story shaped into the familiar tale of creation. This idea is not meant to frighten but to awaken curiosity, Because the past is not as simple as a single timeline laid neatly from one moment to the next. If the truth was hidden to protect faith, then what does that say about the world before faith took its first breath? If the Vatican does hold the last surviving traces of that forgotten age, then somewhere in the darkness of those archives lies a key to understanding who we were long before we became who we are. And the deeper we look, the more one question rises above all the others, a question older than Scripture itself. What if Adam was never the first? Imagine for a moment that the Great Flood was never meant to be just a story about rain and judgment, but a memory of something far larger, a reset so massive that it nearly erased the first version of humanity from the face of the earth. When most people hear the words Great Flood, they picture Noah building an ark and animals walking 2 by 2. But long before the Bible was written, ancient civilizations from every corner of the world were already telling the same haunting story. They spoke of a night when the sky cracked open, when oceans rose like living creatures, and when an entire world was wiped clean, as if someone had taken a hand to a chalkboard and erased everything that had once been written there. This is where the mystery begins. Cultures that never met one another described the same event. The Sumerians told of a flood sent to destroy a strange race of beings. The people of Mesopotamia recorded a deluge so powerful it reset time itself. Ancient Mesoamerican legends speak of an earlier world drowned beneath endless water. These stories are separated by continents and centuries, yet they match in ways too precise to be coincidence. It is as if everyone on Earth was remembering the same nightmare from a time before Adam, a time officially forgotten. What if the flood was not a punishment but a cover-up, a way to bury the remains of a civilization far more advanced than the world that rose afterward? Imagine towers carved from stone that glowed under the sun, machines powered by knowledge we can barely imagine, and cities stretching across lands that no longer even exist. If such a world once stood, the question becomes simple. Who needed it erased? Some researchers believe the flood was not just water, but a moment when history was rewritten, when the people who survived carried only fragments of the truth with them, and those fragments slowly grew into myths. If a great civilization had risen before the one we know, then the earliest humans after the flood would have seen the ruins, but not understood them. They would have told stories trying to explain what they saw, and those stories would have become legends passed down through generations. Imagine a small group of survivors witnessing the remains of a fallen world and being told never to speak of it. Imagine their descendants slowly forgetting, except in whispers and dreams. At some point, the truth would be too faint to see clearly. Only a few would remember that before the flood, there was something greater. This leads to the most unsettling question of all. If the flood erased time, who guided the world that came after? Someone had to decide how the story of humanity would begin again. Someone had to control which memories were kept and which were washed away. And if that someone feared the power of the civilization that came before, then burying it beneath the flood would have been the perfect solution. The Great Flood may not only have changed the world, it may have changed our memory of it. And if all these ancient stories point toward a single forgotten truth, then the world before Adam was real. It just lies beneath the water and beneath the silence of those who needed it forgotten. Genesis is supposed to be the first chapter of everything, the opening line of human history, the moment where time itself begins. But once you look closely, something strange happens. The story rushes forward at an impossible speed. In the beginning, the world is created. Then, almost instantly, Adam appears. Cain and Abel are born. Generations pass in a single breath. And before you can even understand who these early people were, the story jumps straight into the flood, as if someone pressed fast forward on the most important era of all. This compression is not an accident. It feels intentional. like a curtain pulled tight over a stage you are not meant to see. Why would a book meant to explain the beginning of everything skip over centuries as if they hold no meaning? Why are entire lifetimes reduced to a single sentence? And why do some ancient writings suggest that the world between creation and the flood was far more complicated than we are told? Genesis gives only fragments. It speaks of people who lived for almost 1,000 years, yet tells us nothing of what they built or knew. It mentions giants walking the earth, but offers no details of where they came from or what they did. It introduces beings called the sons of God, without ever explaining who they were or why they suddenly appeared. These mysteries are not small. They are cracks in the story, cracks that reveal something was removed, something large. Imagine opening a history book to find the first 300 years missing, except for a few vague lines. You would know instantly that something had been edited. You would ask, who removed those pages and why? Genesis feels exactly like that. A beginning that is not a beginning, but a rewrite. A trimmed down version of a world that might have been too extraordinary or too dangerous to include. This is where the early church enters the story. When Christianity began to rise in power, its leaders faced a serious problem. Thousands of writings existed. Some spoke of worlds before Adam. Some described beings older than humanity. Some told stories that did not fit into a simple timeline. In order to create a single, unified history, the church chose which books were allowed and which were cast aside. Genesis remained, but only in a shortened version stripped of details that could cause questions. Everything else was labelled forbidden or heretical. Why was it so important to define exactly where history begins? Because whoever controls the first chapter controls all that follows. If Adam is the first human, then the church becomes the guardian of the only true timeline. But if there was a world before Adam, a world advanced, powerful and lost, then Genesis becomes not the beginning but a restart, and that would shake the foundations of every belief built upon it. So we are left with a book that feels incomplete, a story missing its middle, a beginning missing its true beginning. The question is not whether pages were removed. The question is what those pages contained. And the deeper we look, the more it becomes clear that the world between creation and the flood was not empty at all. It was a world erased, a world waiting to be remembered. There is a strange feeling you get when you learn that the Bible is not a single book, but a carefully chosen collection, a selected library where many writings were allowed inside, while others were locked out forever. Those missing books have a name. They are called apocrypha, a word that sounds mysterious, yet simply means hidden. And hidden is exactly what they became once the early church decided which stories humanity was allowed to hear and which ones were too dangerous to survive. Among these forbidden texts stand the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and other writings once read by ancient communities, but later pushed into the shadows. They speak of things that do not fit neatly into the story of Adam. They describe a world before the world we know, a world filled with beings who walked among early humans and taught knowledge beyond anything expected in ancient times. Some of these writings describe cities shining with strange light, towers that watched the stars with perfect accuracy, and technologies that sound far too advanced for a people supposedly just beginning their journey on Earth. The Book of Enoch is perhaps the most unsettling. It tells of the Watchers, powerful beings who descended from the heavens and interacted with humankind long before the days of Noah. It speaks of secrets taught to early people, secrets of metal, astronomy, medicine, and the movements of the earth itself. If Enoch is even partly true, then Adam was not born into an empty world. He was born into the ruins of something older, something greater, something erased. The Book of Jubilees goes even further. It lays out a timeline that stretches into ages before Adam, hinting at cycles of history that rise and fall again and again. It suggests that the creation story is not the first time the world began, but simply the most recent time. These ideas conflict with the clean, orderly timeline the Church wanted to promote, so the books were removed. Not destroyed, simply labelled as forbidden and then hidden away until only a handful of scholars even remembered their names. This is where the Vatican becomes the quiet villain. For centuries it claimed to be the guardian of truth, yet it kept these texts sealed behind heavy doors, locked in archives that almost no one is permitted to enter. It is said that early church leaders feared what these writings implied. If there was a world before Adam, then the official story of creation was not the beginning, but a chapter written later. If advanced knowledge existed before the flood, then the idea of a simple, primitive humanity fell apart. And if powerful beings once taught humans long before Scripture was formed, then the structure of religious authority would collapse. So the solution was simple: hide the books, protect the narrative. Let people believe they were living in the only version of history that ever mattered. And over time, the forbidden books faded from public memory until only fragments remained. Yet even in those fragments, you can sense the weight of a truth that refuses to disappear. A truth that speaks of an age when humanity walked alongside beings and cities that should not exist. A truth that was silenced because it threatened the story written in Genesis. The forbidden books whisper of a world before Adam, and every whisper brings us closer to understanding what was taken from the beginning. There is a question that sits quietly behind the stories of Genesis. A question so simple that most people never think to ask it. If Adam was the first human, then why does the earth feel older than his story? Why do the stones beneath our feet whisper of lives, lived long before his name was ever spoken? It is almost as if the Bible does not begin on the first page of human history at all, but starts halfway through, a much older tale, a tale whose first chapters have been torn out or hidden away. Across the world, ancient myths speak of an age before the familiar story of creation. They describe people who lived in harmony with the earth, people who understood the stars, people who built structures so massive and so precise that even today we cannot explain them. These myths do not talk about caves and simple tools. They talk about golden cities shining on mountaintops and sacred knowledge guarded by beings who were not quite human yet not entirely divine. None of this appears in Scripture, yet the echoes of it can be felt everywhere. Look at the ancient megaliths that rise out of the ground like frozen giants, stone circles carved with mathematical precision, massive walls fitted so perfectly that not even a blade of grass can slide between the stones, underground tunnels stretching farther than modern engineers believe possible for early humans. These works do not belong to a world just beginning. They belong to a world already old, already intelligent, already capable of achievements we struggle to match. If Adam was the first human, then who built these monuments? And why do they stand in silence, as if waiting for someone to remember them? Some scholars long ago dared to suggest that there was a civilization before Adam, a civilization advanced not only in the way it built, but in the way it thought. They wrote secret commentaries hidden away in monasteries, describing a humanity that lived in cycles, rising and falling over countless ages. According to them, the people before Adam were not primitive at all. They were guardians of knowledge, students of the heavens, perhaps even explorers of energies and mysteries that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. These ideas never reached the public. They were sealed away because they raised dangerous questions. If humanity existed before Adam, then the story of Genesis is not the story of our beginning, but the story of our restart. It would mean that the world did not begin with a single family in a garden, but rose from the ashes of something that came before. Something that ended suddenly. Something that might have fallen because it grew too powerful or too wise for its own safety. It is unsettling to imagine a forgotten civilization hidden behind the walls of time, yet the clues refuse to disappear. The myths, the megaliths, the secret writings. They all point toward a missing chapter in our story. A chapter that suggests humanity once walked in a world far older and far more advanced than the timeline we have been taught. If the Bible truly begins on page 2, then the hunt for page 1 becomes the greatest mystery of all. And somewhere in that missing chapter lies the truth of who we really were before we were ever called human. Across the world, there are stones that seem to stand outside of time. Stones that look as if they were shaped by hands far stronger and far wiser than anything we are taught about early humanity. These stones rise in places where no written history exists, and yet their presence is louder than any words. They speak without moving. They testify without sound. And the more you look at them, the more you begin to wonder if they were created by the descendants of Adam or by a people who walked the earth long before his story ever began. Take the ancient cyclopean walls found in distant lands. Enormous blocks stacked with impossible precision, some heavier than train engines, lifted and placed as if they weighed nothing at all. There are no tool marks on them, no signs of struggle, no evidence of trial and error. They stand as if built by a civilization that did not need to learn but already knew. Some of these stones are cut with angles so perfect that modern engineers still pause in disbelief. They are not the work of beginners, they are the work of masters. Then there are the precision-cut stones that fit together like puzzle pieces carved by a mind fully aware of geometry and earth movement. These stones resist earthquakes. They resist erosion. They resist the limits of what we think ancient people could do. You can run your fingers along the seams and feel how perfectly they connect. No mortar. No gaps. Only a silent announcement that whoever built them did not live in a world of simple tools and wooden huts. They lived in a world shaped by knowledge that should not exist for early humanity, unless early humanity was not truly the first. And beneath the oceans, things become even stranger. Submerged ruins lie hidden under waves that have covered them for thousands of years. Stone roads stretch across the seafloor. Staircases plunge into darkness where no ancient village should have been. Carved pillars stand like the bones of forgotten cities, swallowed by rising water in a time no one remembers. Some structures are so deep that they must have been built long before the last known civilizations even began to form. They hint at a world that fell before our recorded history had the chance to take its first breath. Mainstream history struggles to explain these places. Scholars call them anomalies, accidents, coincidences. But each stone tells a different story. A story of precision, a story of intention, a story of people who understood the forces of nature in a way that feels almost impossible. If Adam was the first true human then, who taught ancient builders how to cut stone like lasers? Who showed them how to move blocks heavier than houses? Who gave them the knowledge to build structures that still stand after the passing of countless ages? The question is not whether these stones exist. The question is why they exist. They do not match the world described after Adam. They do not fit the timeline we are told to accept. Their presence suggests that someone came before, someone capable of shaping the earth with a mastery we are only beginning to rediscover. These silent stones are more than ruins. They are reminders. Clues left behind by a civilization that refused to vanish completely. And as long as they stand, the truth about the people who built them will never be fully erased. The Book of Enoch feels like a doorway that was sealed shut before most of the world even learned it existed. It is a text that almost made it into the Bible, yet was pushed away at the last moment, hidden for centuries as if someone feared the story it carried. When you read it, the first thing you notice is that it does not describe a simple world beginning with Adam. It describes a world already full of mystery, already shaped by beings who were not human, yet walked beside humans as if they belonged here. These beings were called the Watchers, and according to Enoch, they were not guardians, but rebels who brought knowledge that humanity was never meant to have. Enoch describes the Watchers descending onto the earth in a time before the flood, teaching secrets of the stars, secrets of metal, secrets of the earth, even secrets of the human body. This is not the world of shepherds and farmers we usually imagine before Noah. This is a world buzzing with knowledge almost too advanced for its age. It is a world that sounds more like the memory of a lost civilization than the simple beginning found in Genesis. The Watchers gave gifts that lifted humans into a new level of understanding, but those same gifts also pushed the world toward chaos. If this story were false, it should have disappeared. Yet somehow it survived for thousands of years. It survived through translations held by isolated communities. It survived inside monasteries where monks copied it quietly, even when they were forbidden to. It survived in Ethiopia, where it was treated as sacred long after the Western Church rejected it. Survival like that does not happen by accident. It makes you wonder if Enoch's words carried something too important to let die. The early church said the Book of Enoch was dangerous. It challenged the idea that humans were created into a clean, empty world. It hinted that something powerful existed before Genesis, something that blurred the line between heaven and earth. It suggested that the early world was shaped by visitors whose presence did not fit into a simple timeline. If that were accepted, the story of Adam would no longer be the first chapter, but the second or even the third. This was a threat to the structure of belief the church needed to protect. So Enoch was removed, not because it lacked meaning, but because it carried too much. When Enoch describes the Watchers teaching humans how to work metal and read the stars, he does it with a warning. He says knowledge can lift a world or destroy it. And according to his vision, the world before the flood had become so corrupted by misused knowledge that a reset was the only way to save what remained. That idea fits too well with the traces we see today of vanished cities and forgotten technologies. It feels less like myth and more like a memory passed down from a time when humanity reached too far, too fast. So the question stands: did the Book of Enoch survive because it was wrong or because it was too right? If it was only fantasy, it would have faded centuries ago. But it remains stubborn and unsettling, whispering of a world erased and a truth the Watchers tried to teach before the waters rose and washed everything away. Deep beneath the surface of Rome, far below the marble floors and echoing halls of the Vatican, lies a world the public is never allowed to see. Endless corridors of shelves stretch into the darkness, holding manuscripts that have not felt sunlight in hundreds of years. Among these documents are said to be versions of the Book of Enoch unlike any that survive today, fragments written in ancient hands, copies carried across continents, and pages filled with notes scribbled by monks who lived long before the modern world took shape. These hidden texts raise a question that has haunted scholars for generations. What did the Vatican remove, and why? The Book of Enoch we know today is powerful enough on its own, but imagine a version containing entire sections that were never shared. Imagine passages that speak clearly about the world before Adam, or describe the Watchers in a way that does not allow easy denial. Imagine verses that reveal too much about the time before the flood, a time the church has always kept wrapped in silence. According to whispers from scholars granted rare access, some of these Enochian fragments include drawings of star maps, lists of strange metals, and descriptions of beings who do not fit into any simple theological category. If these details were released, they would break open the timeline that has shaped belief for almost 2,000 years. The Vatican does not deny that it holds ancient texts. It admits that its archives contain thousands of documents not shared with the world. What it does not explain is why certain writings, especially those connected to Enoch, remain locked away behind layers of restrictions. Only a small number of researchers are ever permitted to view them, and even then they must request specific pages by name. They are not allowed to wander. They cannot explore freely. Every page is watched. Every note is monitored. What makes these documents so dangerous? Some believe the answer lies in the handwritten comments left by early church scholars. These notes often reveal the hesitation and fear of those who read the older texts. There are rumours of comments written in the margins saying things like, "Do not include and dangerous for doctrine." One monk reportedly wrote that certain descriptions of the Watchers sounded too real, too detailed, and too connected to stories that predated the Bible itself. Others questioned whether humanity truly began with Adam, or whether he marked only the beginning of a new chapter after a forgotten world had fallen. Someone made the decision to hide these verses. Someone chose which lines humanity was allowed to read and which lines would remain forever buried. These decisions shaped the way billions of people understand the beginning of time. They shaped the story of creation. They shaped the story of humanity. And they created a world where the past is filtered through the hands of those who guard the archives. If the missing Enochian chapters were released, the world might learn that Genesis is only a doorway into a much older story. A story that begins with civilizations erased by water and beings erased by silence. The Vatican holds the keys to these secrets, but for now the doors remain locked. And until they open, we are left to wonder what truths lie hidden in the darkness, waiting for the moment when the world is finally ready to see them. There is something unsettling about an ancient map that shows a world we should not be able to see, a world that existed long before any civilization we know, a world with coastlines that do not match the continents we recognize today. Yet these maps exist. They appear in old libraries, in forgotten collections, and according to many scholars in the deepest map vaults of the Vatican, where only a select few are allowed to enter. They show outlines of lands now buried beneath oceans, islands that vanished without explanation, and shorelines drawn with a precision that should have been impossible for early mapmakers. These maps should not exist if Adam truly marked the beginning of civilization. But they do. One of the most famous examples is a map showing Antarctica without ice, drawn long before modern explorers even reached its frozen edges. Another map shows the exact curves of South America and Africa as if someone had seen them from above. But stranger still are the maps that never reach the public eye. Whispers from researchers who have studied the edges of the Vatican's collection say there are charts that show coastlines that no longer appear on any modern atlas. They describe land bridges connecting continents, cities placed in regions now swallowed by the sea, and islands that once bloomed with life before being wiped away by a flood forgotten by time. If these maps are real, then they raise a powerful question. Who charted them? The civilizations we learn about in school did not have the knowledge or the technology to map the entire world. They did not travel the oceans with such accuracy. They did not know the exact shape of continents they had never seen. So where did this information come from? The simplest answer is also the most shocking. Someone existed before. Someone capable of exploring the world long before recorded history began. Someone whose memory lingers only in the faint lines of ancient cartography. The Vatican's map vaults are known for their secrecy. They hold thousands of documents that have never been shown to the public. Some scholars believe these vaults contain maps drawn from even older sources that survived the Great Flood described in legends. Imagine a group of survivors carrying the last pieces of their world's knowledge into the next age, preserving what they could in scrolls and charts. Imagine those survivors passing their records to early civilizations who copied them without understanding their true age. Over time, the origins of the maps were forgotten, but the drawings remained. If Adam lived in a world just beginning, then maps showing ancient coastlines should not exist, yet they do, quietly challenging the timeline we are told to believe. And the Vatican's refusal to release its full map collection only deepens the mystery. What would happen if the world learned that entire continents once stood where oceans now lie? What if the flood did not just wash away lives, but entire chapters of human history? These maps hint that the world before Adam was real, mapped and known by people we no longer remember. They suggest that the flood did not simply erase a generation, but an entire civilization. And somewhere in the sealed vaults of Rome, the evidence may still be waiting. The lines of ink drawn by hands that lived in a world swallowed by water long before the first story of creation was ever written. Time is supposed to be the one thing no one can change, a river that moves in only one direction. But when you look closely at the way history is recorded, especially in the hands of powerful institutions, you begin to see that time is not as fixed as we are taught. It can be shaped, it can be stretched, it can be edited, and for centuries the Church held the authority to decide exactly when history began, how long it lasted, and which ages were allowed to exist at all. Early civilizations counted time in many different ways. Some measured it from the reigns of kings, others from great floods or celestial events. But when the Church rose to power, it created a new system, one that started with a single moment, the creation of the world, as described in Genesis. Every date that followed was calculated from this beginning. It was a creation counting system designed to anchor history to one story. But when you anchor the world to one story, you also gain the power to erase everything that came before it. Then came calendar reforms that shifted whole centuries. The Julian calendar was replaced by the Gregorian calendar in the 1500s. Days were removed, years were realigned, festivals changed. But what people rarely stop to ask is why the Church was the authority trusted to reshape time itself. When you remove days from a calendar, you do not just change math, you change how history is remembered. You change how people understand the past. You change the timeline that holds the story of humanity together. Some historians believe that entire years may have been added or removed during the early centuries of the Church's growth. If that is true, then the timeline we follow today could be built on missing numbers, missing events, and missing centuries. That kind of power would allow the Church to push the flood deeper into myth, making it seem less like a real historical event and more like a symbolic story. It would also allow any evidence of a pre-Adamic age to slip far beyond the edge of memory, tucked into a time that no longer officially exists. Imagine if the world before Adam was not thousands of years older than we think, but only hidden behind a reshaped calendar. Imagine if the timeline was adjusted not to correct mistakes, but to remove an entire age of humanity that did not fit the Church's vision. If the dates were changed, then the ruins we find today could belong to people who lived far closer to us than we ever imagined. They would not be distant ancestors from a mysterious past. They would be recent survivors of a world rewritten by time. When you control time, you control the beginning. And when you control the beginning, you control the story. For centuries, the Church has held this power quietly, altering calendars, determining creation dates, and guiding how civilizations interpret the past. This does not prove that history was intentionally changed, but it does prove that it could have been. And if even a small part of the timeline was shaped or shifted, then everything before Adam could be hidden not by force, but by the simple adjustment of dates. That is the subtle power of time. It does not scream, it whispers. And in that whisper, the earliest chapters of human history may have been pushed so far into myth that only fragments remain to tell us what really happened before the world began again. Beneath the calm surface of the oceans, there are secrets older than any written story. Entire cities lie in silence, covered in sand and shadow, as if the sea itself became a tomb for a forgotten age. When divers first discover these places, they describe stone streets that still run straight, as if waiting for footsteps that will never return. They find walls carved with symbols no one can translate, and pillars standing upright in the deep, as if the world above simply forgot they were ever there. These ruins are not legends. They are real, and they whisper of a time that should not exist if Adam was the first chapter of humanity. In some places, you can see entire avenues stretching underwater, laid out with a level of planning that suggests knowledge of architecture far beyond the simple early societies we learn about. In others, you find temples with doorways taller than two people standing on each other's shoulders. These structures challenge everything we are told about the timeline of civilization. They force us to ask how such cities could have been built so early unless they belonged to a world erased before Genesis ever opened its first line. The Bible speaks of the deep. It speaks of waters rising. It speaks of worlds being wiped away. But it never says Adam lived in the first world. It only says he lived in the world we know. Apocryphal texts go even further. Some hint that entire civilizations fell before the flood, not just one wicked generation. Others describe cities whose light was extinguished long before the Tower of Babel or the Kingdom of Israel. These stories line up with what lies underwater today. A memory preserved in stone while written history chose silence. Why then are these discoveries treated as curiosities instead of revelations? When archaeologists publish their findings, they often use words like accident or anomaly. They claim the ruins must be younger than they look, or shaped by nature instead of human hands. They create theories that avoid the simplest explanation. These cities do not fit our timeline because our timeline may not be complete. If they truly date back to a pre-Adamic age, then history needs to be rewritten from the ground up. But rewriting history threatens the systems built on top of it. If civilizations existed before Adam, then the opening chapters of Genesis are not the beginning, but a restart. If the flood was not a local event, but a global reset, then everything before it becomes a vanished world swallowed by time and water. Institutions that rely on a fixed timeline would lose their authority. Narratives that depend on humanity beginning at a specific moment would crumble. Perhaps that is why submerged cities are quietly moved aside in textbooks and documentaries. They are too large to ignore, but too dangerous to fully explain. It is easier to pretend they are strange accidents than to admit they might be the ruins of a forgotten age. When you look at these underwater ruins, you are not just looking at broken stone. You are looking at a voice calling from the depths, telling us that the past did not begin where we were taught to begin. These sunken cities are not just evidence. They are warnings that history is larger, older, and far more mysterious than anything written on paper. They wait beneath the waves, patient and silent, knowing that one day the world will have no choice but to listen. Throughout history, monks have been described as quiet figures living in stone halls, copying scripture by candlelight, and praying through the night. But when you look deeper into their movements across continents, you begin to see a different story. These monastic orders were not only guardians of holy writings, they were the custodians of something far older, something the world was never meant to see. They travelled far beyond their monasteries, gathering strange manuscripts and relics that carried whispers of a world erased by the flood, a world that existed before Adam took his first breath. Imagine a Benedictine monk in the 12th century walking through the ruins of a forgotten port city in the east. He picks up a shard of clay etched with symbols no European scholar has ever seen. He finds a scroll sealed in a jar with drawings of stars arranged in patterns that do not match any known constellation. He does not question where these things come from or what vanished civilization made them. He simply wraps them in cloth and places them in his satchel. He has been trained for this. His task is not to understand but to collect. Across oceans and deserts, monks carried out similar missions. Some travelled with traders deep into Asia. Others followed the shadows of the old Roman roads into lands where ancient stones whispered secrets older than empires. They sought anything that did not fit the official story, anything that slipped between the cracks of Genesis and the flood. Ancient maps, metal tablets, carved bones, untranslated books. And when they found such things, they brought them back to Rome, where the items vanished into cellars and vaults beneath the Vatican. These monks never announced their discoveries. They wrote no public reports. Their work was done in silence, shared only through letters exchanged with high-ranking clergy. The Church called this preservation, but preservation quickly turned into disappearance. Scholars who later searched for these relics found nothing. Manuscripts that had been recorded in monastery inventories suddenly vanished. Artifacts once shown quietly to visiting priests were later said to have never existed. It is as if the monks were not only collecting knowledge but sweeping away the evidence that a world existed before the one the Church wanted to tell. Some monks questioned what they were doing. Hidden notes found in old diaries describe their confusion. One wrote that he had found a metal object engraved with writing older than any language he knew. He was ordered to deliver it to Rome immediately and never speak of it again. Another described a stone slab showing a city swallowed by water long before the time of Noah, but his abbot warned him that discussing it would lead to discipline. These monks obeyed, yet their private writings suggest they understood the weight of what they were hiding. The Vatican did not need armies to control the past. It had monks, gentle, quiet, obedient, but powerful in ways the world never realized. They became the custodians of the Great Silence, gathering every clue that pointed to a pre-flood civilization and sealing it behind locked doors. What remains today are only hints. A missing text here, a strange artifact there, a record of an item that no longer exists. Yet if these monks had not travelled the world collecting fragments of the forgotten age, we might have lost every trace of that ancient world forever. Their silence buried the truth, but their actions preserved it. And deep beneath Rome, those hidden pieces of a lost civilization may still be waiting for someone brave enough to break the silence they left behind. When most people hear the story of the Great Flood, they picture a gentle children's tale of Noah building a wooden ark while animals line up 2 by 2. But when you step away from the simplified version and look at the way ancient cultures describe the flood, you see something entirely different. The flood is not treated as a simple punishment. It is described as a reset, a complete wiping of a world that had grown twisted and dangerous. It was not the end of ordinary people. It was the end of giants, demigods, and hybrid beings that should never have existed in the first place. In the book of Genesis, the flood arrives quickly, almost too quickly, as if something terrible had happened that the writers did not want to explain fully. It says the world was filled with violence, but it never describes the source of that violence. Then it mentions mysterious beings called the sons of God, who came down and fathered children with human women. Their offspring were giants called the Nephilim, beings with power and strength that terrified early humanity. That short passage feels like a flash of lightning, revealing a vast world behind it before the text immediately moves on. Other cultures tell the story in greater detail. In Mesopotamian legend, the gods send the flood because humans had become corrupted by beings who were not entirely human. In Greek myth, the gods send a deluge to wipe out a race of giants who climbed mountains and defied the heavens. In Norse tales, the first world is drowned to destroy monstrous beings that had spread across the land. Even in Mesoamerican stories, There are hints of tall beings and almost supernatural creatures wiped out by rising water. These stories are separated by oceans and centuries, yet they all describe the same event: a world filled with hybrid beings destroyed in a single wave. The Book of Enoch goes further than all of them. It describes the Watchers teaching forbidden knowledge that warped early humanity. It describes giants so large they devoured everything around them. It speaks of a planet groaning under the weight of these unnatural beings until the sky itself opened and the waters fell. This is not the cozy bedtime version of the flood. This is a cosmic reset, a restart of the world after a civilization unraveled far beyond repair. If this version is true, then Noah's story is not just about survival. It is about the end of an age the Bible barely mentions. It is the closing chapter of a timeline filled with beings and cities that no longer match the simple image of early humanity. Noah becomes not just a righteous man, but the bridge between two worlds, one lost and one beginning. So was the Great Flood a punishment or a reset? The answer may be both. It punished the corruption, but it also wiped the slate clean, erasing a world that was never meant to remain. That raises an even deeper question. If the flood erased a civilization before Adam's descendants spread across the earth, how much of what we call ancient history is actually the remains of that forgotten age? The children's story gives us a boat and animals. The ancient world gives us giants, hybrid beings, and a world drowning to silence everything it could no longer control. There is a moment in ancient scripture where the tone suddenly shifts. A moment when the story of early humanity becomes strange enough that most people skim past it without thinking. It says, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives, and from these unions came giants and mighty beings of old." For many, this line is treated as a myth or a poetic metaphor, something symbolic rather than real. But what if it is not metaphor at all? What if it is a censored memory of something that once walked the earth? Something the later writers of Scripture did not know how to explain. When you read the original passages, they do not sound like legends. They sound like records. They describe beings who were not human but looked enough like humans to mix with them. They describe hybrid offspring who grew into giants, warriors, and rulers whose power threatened the balance of the world. Some texts even describe these hybrids as possessing knowledge and abilities far beyond the humans around them. This idea appears again and again across ancient cultures. In Greece, demigods walked between mortals and gods. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu were described as part divine and part human. In India, the Vedic stories speak of shining beings teaching knowledge to early people. None of these stories seem connected, yet they all carry the same theme: a blending of worlds that produced beings too powerful and too dangerous to last. If these stories are memories rather than myths, then they suggest something unsettling. They suggest that humanity carries echoes of these unions, not in stories but in genetic memory. Strange tales of giants and powerful ancestors might not be fantasy, but the fading memory of a world erased by flood and rewritten by religion. Some scientists even wonder why certain genetic markers appear in isolated populations without explanation, markers that do not match the slow and steady model of human evolution. Could these be remnants of an ancient mixture the world has forgotten? This brings us to the Vatican and its unusual interest in genealogy. For centuries, the Church has kept records of bloodlines with an intensity that goes far beyond simple history. Certain families were tracked with exact precision, certain names were protected, certain lines of descent were recorded even when most people in those eras could not read or write. Why would a religious institution care so deeply about lineage unless they were guarding something older than their own history? There are rumours of genealogical books stored in the Vatican that trace ancestry far past the time of Abraham. Books that speak of lines that survived the flood and lines that did not. Some say these records point to families carrying fragments of ancient blood, not mystical, but historical. If true, these books would reveal patterns that challenge everything we believe about human origins. They would show that the unions between the sons of God and the daughters of men were not stories, but events powerful enough to echo across thousands of years. The idea that angels or divine beings engage with humans sounds impossible until you realize ancient people may have seen advanced beings and used the only language they had to describe them. To a shepherd in the time before written history, a being who descended from the sky would be an angel. To us, it might be something else entirely. The mystery remains because the guardians of history have chosen silence. The Vatican's careful protection of certain genealogies suggests they know more than they share, more than the world is ready to accept. If humanity truly carries memories, stories, and perhaps even tiny traces of a world where angels and hybrids walked the earth, then the line between myth and truth may be far thinner than we ever imagined. Across the early centuries of Christianity, there were voices that whispered of something far older than the Garden of Eden. These mystics and Gnostics spoke of worlds before worlds, ages rising and collapsing like waves long before Adam was placed into the story. Most of their writings vanished, burned as heresy or sealed away, but fragments survive, like sparks drifting from a forgotten fire. These fragments suggest a gospel the world was never allowed to read, a gospel of the lost ages. In certain Gnostic texts, the universe is described not as a single creation, but as a cycle, a spiral of civilizations that rise, flourish, fall, and rise again. They speak of humanity existing in multiple forms across countless ages, each one learning, forgetting, and learning again. They describe the flood not as the first great disaster, but simply the most recent, the last reset in an endless chain of resets. In their stories, Adam is not the first human, but the first human of a new age, placed onto an earth already scarred by former worlds. This idea never appears in the official Bible, yet early followers debated it openly before such debates became forbidden. Some early church fathers even hinted at these ideas in their commentaries. There are records of theologians writing that God renewed the world rather than created it from nothing. Others noted that Genesis seemed to start abruptly, as if something had happened before it that was purposely left out. A few even questioned why so many ruins scattered across the ancient world looked far older than what Scripture allowed. These early thinkers wondered whether a pre-Adamic age existed, an age destroyed so completely that only fragments survived. But over time, these writings were edited. Some were softened, others erased. Later versions of the same commentaries show missing sentences, rewritten paragraphs, and footnotes crossed out, as if someone feared the questions they raised. The official story became cleaner, simpler, safer. Creation began at one point, and anything before that point was pushed into silence. Yet the older manuscripts, the ones hidden in monasteries and private collections, still carry the original words. They show that early Christianity once held a far wider view of time, a view that included forgotten civilizations and vanished ages. Imagine a dusty scroll found in a desert monastery, copied by a monk who never questioned its meaning. In its faded ink, it describes a world before the world, a place where humans lived in harmony with beings of light. Imagine another fragment describing a great destruction that came not from God's anger, but from the collapse of an age too advanced for its own survival. These pieces feel like echoes, like the last remaining notes of a song that once filled the world. If these fragments were ever gathered and compared, they would form a picture that challenges everything we know. They would show that the idea of a single creation is new, shaped by the needs of an institution rather than the truth of memory. The earlier believers seem to understand that humanity has lived many times, waking in new forms across new ages. They treated the flood not as a beginning, but as a turning of the page. The Gospel of the Lost Ages is not a book you can hold. It is a shadow made from all the missing pieces, all the erased teachings, all the censored commentaries. It is the story behind the story, the world behind Genesis, the truth that once slipped through the cracks before being sealed away. And somewhere in the vaults of Rome, the full version may still exist, waiting for a world finally ready to remember who it used to be. Beneath the shining marble floors of St. Peter's Basilica, there is a world almost no one has seen. It does not appear on tourist maps, and even most Vatican workers are never allowed to enter it. This place is a labyrinth of stone corridors that twist like the roots of an ancient tree. The air grows colder with each step, and the silence becomes so heavy that even a whisper feels too loud. This is the vault beneath St. Peter's, the heart of the church's greatest secrets, a place where the past is not studied but locked away. Imagine walking through these hidden halls with only a dim lantern to guide the way. Shadows stretch across shelves that run farther than the eye can follow. Dust hangs in the air like ancient breath. Each shelf carries manuscripts so old their edges crumble at the slightest touch. Some are wrapped in animal skins, others sealed in wooden boxes carved with symbols that do not belong to any known language. These are the kinds of texts that never reach the world above. In one chamber, there are maps laid flat inside glass cases. The drawings are delicate, yet impossibly accurate. They show coastlines that do not match the ones we know today. A vast landmass appears, where the Atlantic now rolls over its waves. Islands are drawn in places that modern satellites show as empty ocean. One map shows Antarctica without ice, its mountains and rivers marked clearly by a hand that must have lived long before humanity knew that frozen land even existed. These maps feel like windows into a world that drowned before Adam's story began. Farther into the vault, there are iron chests, stacked from floor to ceiling. Their locks are thick and dark with age. Some people believe these chests contain pre-flood chronicles written by civilizations that vanished beneath rising water. The idea seems unbelievable until you notice the symbols carved into the metal. They match the carvings found on submerged ruins thousands of miles away. It is as if these chests hold the last surviving records of a world erased by time and fear. Another room holds astronomical charts spread across massive tables. The star positions marked on them do not match the sky we see today. The constellations appear shifted, as if the world once turned under a different arrangement of heavens. These charts seem to come from cultures long forgotten, cultures that studied the sky with a precision we struggle to match even with modern tools. If these charts are real, they could prove that humanity once possessed knowledge far beyond what our history books allow. Every corner of this vault feels like a silent challenge to the official story of the world. The deeper you wander, the more you realize that the past kept here is not a collection of mistakes or myths. It is a mosaic of truths too powerful or too dangerous to release, a truth that could change how humanity sees itself. Standing in the deepest chamber, you might sense that the vault is not only a place of storage, but a place of control. What is kept hidden shapes what the world believes. What is withheld shapes what the world becomes. The vault beneath St. Peter's is not simply an archive. It is a gate between the world that was and the world we are allowed to remember. Modern science often feels like a bright light moving across the surface of the past, revealing things we never knew and confirming things we once only guessed. But every now and then that light touches something it cannot fully explain. A bone too old, a ruin too advanced, a layer of earth that speaks of a disaster far earlier than the timeline of 6,000 to 7,000 years many religious traditions still defend. When this happens, the reaction is strangely predictable. The evidence is reframed, minimized, or quietly left alone. It is as if the world of science is allowed to explore the past only as long as it does not wander too far into forbidden territory. Take geology. There are places where massive layers of sediment reveal a catastrophe that happened not thousands, but tens of thousands of years ago. Gigantic flood deposits stretch across continents in ways that do not fit the neat biblical timeline. Some scientists argue for ancient superfloods long before Noah's story, events that would have wiped out entire civilizations. Yet these ideas rarely reach the public. They remain buried in academic papers because acknowledging them risks opening a door to questions that challenge everything about the official version of early human history. Archaeology faces the same problem. In caves, deserts, and jungles, researchers find structures far older than recorded civilization. Carved stones that look like they were shaped by hands long before the rise of Egypt or Sumer. Tools that seem too advanced for their assigned age. Footprints next to fossils that should not exist together. Every discovery whispers that humanity may have lived through more cycles than we were taught. But instead of adjusting the story, many experts adjust the interpretation. They say the dating must be wrong or the object contaminated. Anything is acceptable except the possibility that humans or human-like beings existed long before Adam. Genetics adds even more confusion. Studies sometimes detect sudden jumps in human development that do not match slow evolution. Entire branches of ancient DNA appear and disappear in patterns no one fully understands. Some genetic markers hint at contact between different kinds of humans or even beings who do not match any known group. These findings are so unusual that researchers often tuck them into the category of anomalies. Not wrong, but not worth exploring. The message is clear. Do not ask questions that lead too far into the dark. Religious institutions rarely need to speak out publicly. Their influence is quiet but powerful. Seminaries teach only the safe timeline. Museums avoid exhibits that complicate the traditional story. Academic funding leans toward projects that reinforce familiar narratives. It is not a loud conspiracy. It is a gentle pressure, a constant reminder that some questions should remain small. But truth does not shrink, it waits. And every time science touches the forbidden, something stirs beneath the surface. A layer of rock that contradicts the timeline. A ruin where no ruin should exist. A gene that should not be there. These clues do not vanish simply because people look away. Perhaps the real reason the questions remain small is because the answers, if allowed to grow, would demand that we redraw the entire map of human history. They would force us to admit that the world is older, stranger, and far more mysterious than any simple timeline allows. And somewhere between science and silence lies the truth about the ages that came before us, waiting for someone brave enough to follow the evidence wherever it leads. There are names that once echoed through universities and churches, names spoken with respect, curiosity, and even admiration, until the moment they crossed an invisible line. The moment they suggested that Adam might not have been the first human, only the beginning of a new chapter. After that, their stories changed, their books vanished, their careers collapsed, their voices fell into the long shadow cast by the guardians of official history. These are the scholars who went too far. One was a young archaeologist in the early 1900s who uncovered tools buried deep beneath a layer of earth far older than any accepted human settlement. At first, his discovery was celebrated. Newspapers praised him. Universities invited him to speak. But when he suggested these tools might belong to a people who lived before the timeline of Genesis, support turned into silence. Letters stopped coming. His funding disappeared. When he published his theory independently, the academic world mocked him. Within a few years, he retired in isolation, and his findings were locked away in museum storage, where they remain today, mislabeled and forgotten. Another was a priest in the 1800s who studied ancient languages with remarkable skill. He found that certain early commentaries on Genesis implied there had been many worlds before the present one. One commentary even suggested that Adam's creation marked the beginning of a covenant, not the beginning of humanity. Excited, he presented these findings to his superiors. They were not impressed. Within months, he was transferred to a remote parish where his research was confiscated. His translations never saw the light of day again. The official reason was disorderly scholarship, yet those who knew him said he was punished for asking the wrong question. A third story comes from a theologian in the mid-20th century who dared to write a book arguing that the Bible intentionally skips over an earlier age. He claimed the first verses of Genesis hinted at a destroyed world beneath the surface of the text. He wrote that Adam was chosen from among humans already living on the earth. Before the book could be published, his publishing contract was cancelled. His academic position was quietly taken away. Friends distanced themselves. He died with only a typewritten manuscript in a drawer. After his death, the manuscript vanished. No one knows who took it. Even scientists have walked too close to this boundary. A geneticist in the early 2000s found evidence of ancient DNA patterns that did not match the known branches of early humans. When he suggested the possibility of a forgotten population before recorded history, his research funding dried up. His lab closed within a year. He still speaks about his findings, but only online, where he is called eccentric or misguided. The pattern never changes. Anyone who approaches the pre-Adamic question becomes an outsider. The world often claims that history is guided by facts and logic. Yet these stories reveal another force at work, a quiet hand pushing away anyone who gets too close to the hidden layers beneath Genesis. The scholars are not ruined because their ideas are foolish. They are ruined because their ideas are dangerous. Their work threatens the tidy timeline that has been protected for centuries. Their questions tear at the curtain that hides a world older and far more complex than the one we are allowed to believe. In the end, these scholars are remembered only by whispers, their discoveries scattered like ashes. But their stories remain as warnings, reminders that the truth about humanity's past lies just beyond a line no one is supposed to cross. There is a strange feeling that comes when you listen to ancient flood stories from cultures that never met each other. It is like hearing the same dream told in different languages, each version carrying a small piece of something larger. The flood appears everywhere, not just as a disaster, but as a dividing line between what humanity remembers and what it has forgotten. It begins to feel less like a single event and more like a curtain drawn across the mind of the world. A kind of collective amnesia, a drowning not only of cities and people but of memory itself. When you look at human culture through this lens, everything begins to shift. Myths become more than stories. They become messages carried across time by people who sensed that something had been lost. Rituals become echoes of rituals practiced long before Adam. Even architecture begins to resemble a fossil of thought, something built from instinct rather than invention, like hands remembering shapes they were never taught in this life. These fragments are like shells washed up on a shore after a great wave. You cannot see the lost continent beneath the water, but the shells prove it existed. Many ancient traditions speak of a golden age before the flood, a time when humanity walked with beings of great knowledge or lived under skies that moved differently. Some say humans lived longer, others say they understood the stars in ways we can barely imagine now. These descriptions do not match the world we know today. They feel like memories from a dream just before waking, fading as soon as you try to hold them. But they also feel too consistent to be coincidence. Even the Bible quietly hints at this forgotten world. It mentions giants, mighty men, and strange beings who lived on Earth before Noah. It speaks of a world filled with corruption, but never fully explains what that corruption was. Apocryphal texts fill in the gaps, but those texts were pushed away, banned, or hidden. The message that survives in official scripture is simple. The world before the flood was wiped clean. Everything began again. But why begin again unless the first world had grown into something unrecognizable? Something that needed to be erased, not only physically, but mentally. Look at ancient architecture, and you will see shapes repeated across continents that had no connection. Pyramids, stone circles, stair-step temples, symbols carved the same way in places separated by oceans. It is as if humanity carried a blueprint from the old world without remembering the world it came from. These structures feel like instinct, like the memory of a song that humans once knew by heart. But when the flood came, that song was drowned, leaving only the faint rhythm trapped in stone. Perhaps this is why cultures across the world cling to myths and rituals with such intensity. Deep inside those stories lie pieces of the world before Adam, pieces no one can fully explain. People burn incense, chant ancient words, align temples with stars they no longer understand. They do these things because something inside them remembers, something older than recorded history, something older than scripture. The flood, in this sense, becomes more than a wall of water. It becomes a boundary of the mind. Everything before it becomes the submerged continent of human memory, a place we can sense but cannot fully reach. And everything after it becomes the story we know, the story written for a humanity that had forgotten its first chapters. If the world truly lost its memory once, then the ruins, myths, and rituals that survive are not curiosities. They are clues. They are the last floating pieces of a world swallowed by water, waiting for someone to gather them and remember who we used to be before the flood took the truth away. The Renaissance is usually described as a miracle, a sudden explosion of genius that lit up Europe after 1,000 years of darkness. Painters mastered anatomy overnight. Architects rediscovered lost geometry as if remembering a dream. Scholars began writing about the cosmos with confidence that seemed impossible for their time. We are told this happened because people found old Greek and Roman manuscripts, as if civilization simply remembered how to breathe again. But when you look closer, the Renaissance feels less like a rebirth and more like a carefully staged rediscovery, a moment when ancient knowledge was released not freely but selectively. Certain families gained power almost instantly during this era. They sponsored artists and thinkers who seemed to possess abilities far beyond anything taught in schools. These families had strong ties to the church, and some had private access to libraries no ordinary person would ever see. It is as if they drank from a reservoir of hidden wisdom that had been guarded for centuries. The Medici family is one example. They appeared almost from nowhere, with wealth and influence strong enough to shape the future of Europe. The artists they supported were not ordinary talents. They worked with knowledge that felt older than Rome itself. Look at Leonardo da Vinci. His inventions appear centuries ahead of his time. His studies of the human body show a precision that should have been impossible without access to ancient medical texts. His knowledge of engineering and flight seems almost too advanced to be the result of simple curiosity. It is as if he was remembering something the world had forgotten. Michelangelo carved statues with an understanding of proportion and symmetry that echoes the geometry found in ancient ruins. These artists did not discover new ideas. They uncovered old ones, ideas that had been buried or hidden long before their births. Scholars of the era also show this strange pattern. Some wrote about astronomy as if they had access to star charts lost since the flood. Others described mathematical principles that seemed to belong to civilizations far older than Greece. Their knowledge did not grow slowly. It arrived in sudden leaps, as if a door had opened and then closed again. The church played a quiet but powerful role in this. Many monasteries sent out carefully selected manuscripts during the Renaissance, texts that had been locked away for centuries, but they did not release everything. Only certain ideas were allowed to surface. Only certain scholars were allowed to read them. The timing was precise. The world was changing. The church needed to appear as the guide of that change, rather than its enemy. Allowing controlled knowledge to leak into the public created the appearance of progress while keeping the deepest truths hidden. It is strange that the Renaissance happened exactly when the church faced rising doubt and challenge. Ancient wisdom appeared at the perfect moment to strengthen the foundations of faith. It painted the church as the guardian of knowledge rather than the gatekeeper who had hidden it. But beneath that surface glow, something feels staged. The sudden brilliance of art and science seems too sharp, too coordinated, too dependent on access to teachings that no one was supposed to have. If some of that knowledge came from a world before Adam, preserved in secret vaults and forbidden archives, then the Renaissance was not a beginning. It was a reminder, a glimpse of a forgotten age, released in small pieces, enough to inspire, but never enough to reveal the full truth hidden beneath centuries of silence. There is a reason the idea of a world before Adam makes certain people uneasy. It is not just about history. It is about power. The story of Adam is more than a tale of beginnings. It is the foundation upon which entire doctrines rest. If Adam was the first human, then original sin has a single starting point. If he was the first chosen being, then the idea of a chosen people has a clear lineage. If revelation began with him, then everything that follows builds upon a single unbroken line. But if humanity existed long before Adam, rising and falling through forgotten ages, then these doctrines begin to crack. The ground beneath them shifts. And the Vatican has always understood how dangerous that shift could be. Imagine a world where humans lived countless cycles before the one described in Genesis. Civilizations rising in brilliance, falling into ruin, and leaving behind ruins and myths like faint fingerprints on stone. In such a world, Adam is not the first man, but the first man of a new covenant, a new story written after the flood erased everything that came before. This does not make the Bible meaningless, it makes it incomplete. And incompleteness threatens the idea that Scripture holds the full and final truth. Original sin becomes complicated as well. If pre-Adamic humans existed, then morality did not begin with a fruit and a garden. The human story becomes larger, older, and far more complex. Sin becomes something inherited not from one man, but from the endless cycles of human mistakes across forgotten ages. This opens the door to questions the Church has never wanted people to ask. Questions about responsibility, freedom, and the nature of the soul. If Adam was the beginning of a new age, then humanity before him cannot be blamed for the world's fall. And that means the story the Church has preached for centuries is only one chapter of a much longer book. The idea of a chosen people also begins to shift. Many religions and institutions rely on the belief that their story is the first, the most important, or the only true revelation. But if ancient civilizations existed before Adam, with wisdom equal to or greater than the cultures that came after, then no single group can claim to be the original receivers of divine knowledge. Revelation becomes universal. History becomes shared. The Church becomes one guardian among many, rather than the singular keeper of truth. Exclusive revelation weakens even further. If knowledge existed before the biblical timeline, then Scripture is not the first message humanity received from the divine or the unknown. It is simply the most recent. And that idea can terrify institutions built on being the sole messenger. This is the real motive behind limiting the past. Not fear of history itself, but fear of losing control over the meaning of history. If humanity has lived many times before, then no one can claim to own the story of creation. No one can claim to be the beginning or the end. The Vatican, long positioned as the central storyteller of the Western world, would become only one voice among countless forgotten ones. The theology of limiting the past is not about protecting faith, it is about protecting authority. Because if the world before Adam is ever fully acknowledged, then humanity will realize that its story is far older, deeper, and more mysterious than any single institution ever dared to reveal. When you look at the pieces one by one, they seem like curiosities. An impossible ruin here, a strange verse there, a map showing a coastline that should not exist, a doctrine that feels oddly silent about the world before Adam. But when you begin to place these fragments side by side, a different picture emerges. It is like finding broken shards of pottery scattered across a field, and suddenly realizing they all belong to the same ancient vessel. The official beginning, the neat story of a first garden and a first man, begins to crack under the weight of these forgotten clues. Start with the ruins. Massive stones cut with impossible precision. Cities sitting beneath the sea where no cities should be. Temples aligned with star patterns that shift over tens of thousands of years. These structures do not belong to a world that began 6,000 years ago. They belong to a world already old by the time Adam enters the story. They feel like the bones of a civilization wiped out long before the garden was ever planted. Then look at the maps. Ancient charts drawn with accuracy no early culture should have had. Coastlines of lands swallowed by rising oceans. Islands that no longer exist. Star maps showing the sky as it looked in ages long forgotten. These maps speak of explorers who charted the world before the flood reshaped the earth. If Adam was the first human, then who made these maps? And why did so many end up hidden in vaults no one is allowed to enter? The apocryphal verses tell the same story. The Book of Enoch describing beings who walked the earth before the flood. The Book of Jubilees hinting at earlier cycles of creation. Forgotten commentaries from early church fathers mentioning ages before the one in Genesis. These writings were not rejected because they lacked truth. They were rejected because they carried too much of it. They suggested that humanity had a history deeper and stranger than the official story allowed. Forbidden doctrines add even more cracks. The idea that angels mingled with humans. The idea that giants once ruled the land. The idea that knowledge far beyond early humanity existed long before the first biblical patriarchs. These teachings were pushed aside because they pointed toward a world that did not begin with Adam, but survived before him. Piece by piece, the evidence suggests that the Garden of Eden was not the beginning of humanity. It was the beginning of a controlled beginning, a fenced-off restart created after a world was drowned, shattered, or erased. Eden becomes less like the cradle of creation and more like the first chapter of a new era written on top of the ruins of the last. Imagine standing in a world just after the flood, with the remains of ancient cities still visible over distant hills. Imagine survivors walking through the ruins of towers and temples they did not build. Imagine a new story being written to explain what happened. A story clean enough to help people start again. Genesis becomes that story, a simplified beginning created after the real beginning had already been washed away. The cracks in the official beginning are not small. They run across continents, across scriptures, across the memories of entire cultures. They tell us the same thing in different ways. Humanity did not start in a garden. Humanity restarted in a garden. The world before Adam may have been destroyed, forgotten, or silenced, but its echoes remain everywhere, in stone, in myth, in maps, in forbidden pages, and as those cracks continue to widen, the truth beneath them slowly rises, like land emerging from a receding tide. A truth that says our story is far older than we were taught, and the Garden of Eden may have been built on ground already rich with the memories of a world that came before. When most people imagine Noah's Ark, they picture a wooden vessel carrying animals through endless rain. But when you look deeper into the symbolism of that story, it becomes clear that the Ark is more than a boat. It is a container of memory, a vessel meant to preserve what mattered most while the world around it was wiped clean. The physical Ark saved life from the flood, but perhaps there was another Ark hidden in the shadows of history, one that carried knowledge through a different kind of flood, not of water but of time. And if such an Ark existed, the most likely place it would rest is Rome. The Vatican has often been called the guardian of truth, yet guardianship is not always the same as sharing. Beneath its stone floors lies a vast archive filled with manuscripts so old they crumble at the edges. Many of these texts describe worlds before the one in Genesis. Others speak of civilizations destroyed long before Noah's story begins. These records may be the fragments of what survived the Great Reset, the intellectual cargo of a world drowned by disaster. If Noah carried animals to preserve life, then the Vatican carried memory to preserve history, even if that history was kept from the world. Picture ancient scribes copying stories whispered by survivors of the flood. These survivors would not have carried only seeds and livestock. They would have carried knowledge. The star charts of their people, the story of the giants, the warnings of the watchers, the maps of old coastlines. They would have carried fragments of the world that came before, knowing that once the waters dried, a new humanity would need guidance. Over time, these memories would be written, recopied, translated, and hidden until only a few pieces survived. Those pieces may now rest in locked rooms behind Vatican walls. It is strange that so many ancient texts describing pre-flood civilizations survived not through nations or empires, but through monasteries. Monks preserved writings that did not fit the official timeline. They stored books no longer considered safe. They acted as silent archivists, choosing what to save and what to bury. In this way, the Vatican became a second ark, collecting the intellectual and spiritual relics of a world erased. It preserved the memory of ages humanity was not allowed to remember, dividing the pieces and locking them away like animals placed into separate pens. What if the most precious cargo saved from the ancient world was not animals, but knowledge? What if that knowledge was judged too dangerous to release? A world that had just restarted would be fragile. A world trying to rebuild its identity could not handle memories of giants, beings from the sky, advanced cities or civilizations far older than Adam. So the knowledge was protected, censored, and sealed. Not destroyed, but hidden. The Ark saved life. The Vatican saved memory. But memory divided becomes memory controlled. Imagine walking through the archives and seeing a scroll that describes the last days before the flood. Imagine another scroll detailing the cities swallowed by rising waters. Imagine a fragment explaining what the Watchers taught and why that knowledge had to be wiped away. Imagine maps of a world before the oceans rose, carefully rolled and stored in iron chests. These things could change everything we believe about our past. If Noah's Ark preserved the physical world, then the Vatican's Ark preserved the mental world, the world of stories, warnings, and ancient truths. But by keeping that knowledge locked away, the story we inherit is only half a story. The rest sits in silence beneath Rome. And until those doors open, the flood will continue to wash over our memory, leaving us with only the pieces the guardians of the second ark allow us to see. As we reach the end of this journey, the story turns back toward you, not with answers, but with the same quiet mystery that has followed humanity since the moment we first looked at the stars. We are not here to prove a lost civilization before Adam. We are here to feel the weight of the questions, to notice how the shadows of forgotten worlds fall across the pages of our history, and to wonder why so many clues seem to be pointing toward a beginning older than the one we were taught. The truth may not come as a single revelation. It may arrive in fragments just like the ruins, myths, and forbidden texts that brought us to this point. Think about everything left behind for us. Stones cut with perfect precision that should not exist. Maps showing coastlines erased by rising seas. Ancient books describing beings who lived before the world we know. Strange verses tucked into scripture telling of giants and watchers. Each piece is like a voice calling from across time saying, "Look again, listen closely. Something happened before the first beginning. Something important." If the Vatican truly holds knowledge of worlds erased before ours, then our understanding of history becomes less like a straight line and more like a spiral. Civilizations rise, fall, and rise again. Stories begin and end, only to begin once more. The flood may not have been the only reset. It may have been one of many, another turn of the spiral in a pattern older than any recorded culture. And if this is true, then you and I are standing in another turn of that ancient pattern, living in a world that has forgotten what came before but is slowly remembering. There is a strange comfort in this idea. It means humanity is not as fragile as we think. We have survived ages of fire, water, and silence. We have rebuilt ourselves again and again, carrying small echoes of the past in our myths, our rituals, our buildings, and even our dreams. It means the questions that stir inside you are not random. They are part of a much older curiosity passed down through generations who sensed that the official story was too small. Imagine for a moment that the vaults of the Vatican opened completely. Imagine seeing scrolls describing the last days of a world before Adam. Imagine reading maps drawn by people who watched their cities drown. Imagine star charts used by a forgotten civilization that understood the heavens differently from us. This would not shatter faith, it would expand it. It would show that creation is not a single moment, but an unfolding tapestry woven across countless ages. But for now, those doors remain closed. We are left with hints, questions, and the quiet feeling that our story began long before the first pages of the Bible. That does not make our world smaller. It makes it bigger. It makes every sunrise a reminder that humanity is ancient, resilient, and filled with mysteries still waiting to surface. As you step away from this journey, hold on to the questions. Let them deepen your curiosity rather than your fear. Let them inspire you to look twice at the things the world calls strange. Because somewhere out there beneath the oceans, beneath the ruins, beneath the silence of old vaults, lies the rest of our story, waiting for the moment when someone finally listens